All right. All right, everybody. My name is Tiffany Fontenot, and I'm half of We Are Here, a literacy space for Black boys and young Black men. And today we have a special guest. He is author and educator Desmond Williams. He currently has a book, The Burning House, Educating Black Boys in Modern America, and we're going to talk to him about literacy and much more. Thank you for being here today, Mr. Williams. How are you doing?
Tiffany, I'm doing good. It's good to be here with you. And yeah, looking forward to breaking bread with you.
All right. So let's get this started. Looking back, I always, when we start talking about literacy and education, when I talk to people, I like to understand what their journey was. So when you look back at your education, what were your reading habits like as a child?
Yeah, so that's interesting because I wasn't like an avid reader. Reading really started for me. Like my father
Mhm, mhm,
reading magazines, but when I got into music, like my first like venture into reading was reading liner notes on the tapes that I bought when I was, 9 and 10 years old. Um, but I think the first book that I read was probably in high school. It was Of Mice and Men. But I remember my elementary teacher, specifically my fifth grade teacher, Miss O'Connor, reading My Side of the Mountain to us. She also read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which I thought was like at the time the world's greatest book. But I think my reading habits started with like a combination of things as opposed to like a particular starting point. But I think seeing my father Saturday and Sunday mornings always reading, and then just being interested in what my favorite rappers were saying outside of the music was a super huge influence on me.
That's interesting. You're one of the first people I've heard to talk about that. I think that's where I got a lot of my reading experiences from, and I ended up reading biographies and that. So when you were in this space of like looking at MCs and hip hop and stuff like that, and you were reading liner notes and things like that, were you interested in becoming an MC or hip hop, or was it just being a music fan?
Yeah, I was always a consumer. I was never producing anything,
Mhm.
but it was hero worship. I'm dating myself, but like LL Cool J was my hero. So it's like when you got tired of, if there's a such thing, if you got tired of listening to CD until it was just like warped, it's like, well, let me go back to the liner notes, right?
Mhm.
So it was really a form of reverence, um, and the Run DMCs and the EPMDs and the NWAs
Eric B. and
and things like,
Rakim, all
oh
that.
man,
Don't get me started.
yeah. And I remember uh it's not the Bad album. Man, I'm drawing a blank. It was one of the first tapes that I bought that had all of the lyrics in it, and I'm drawing a blank.
Is it
And it just
radio? You talking about which LL Cool J? We'll go.
no, it wasn't an LL album. It was I think it was EPMD Unfinished Business. And it just changed my world. Like it was EPMD Unfinished Business because Eric Sermon had a list, and I was like, oh, I know exactly what he's saying now.
That's hilarious. And two, it's interesting you bring this up because hip hop is really very intricate when you think of rhyme patterns and lyrics and things like that, and why, and the historical connections to it, and the complexity of it, the way that it got, like hip hop got dogged when you think about the early days, and to the fact that when I look back and read certain lyrics now, like when I look at like DJ Jazzy Jeff Scratching or LL Cool J and
Mhm.
things like that in their lyrics, I'm like, this is really,
I
like this is. Go ahead.
So this is a true story. Um, like my wife and daughters were binge watching The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and I just threw on. I was with my daughters. We were driving home, and I threw on. He's the DJ. I'm the rapper, and I was like, "Do you know who you're listening to?" And my daughter was like, "No, I have no idea." I was like, "You don't recognize that voice?" A guy who calls himself. But anyway, I was listening to the lyrics, and Will Smith said, and nobody confuses Will Smith with being like a lyricist. But he said, if I was Fred Flintstone, I probably own all of Bedrock. If I was a criminal, I probably own a cell block. If I was in the Navy, I would own the whole sea, but I'm a poet, so I own the whole rhyme industry. And I was like, damn, that was dope. And I was surprised that I knew it because it was 32 years ago. But when he was saying it, I was like right there with him.
And he didn't
And
read his first book till 20, his first full book till he was 20.
yeah, and that album in particular, um, along with the Great Adventures of Slick Rick and the Beastie Boys, the storytelling, and going back to LL Cool J, My Rhyme Ain't Done, the Bristol Hotel, which changed my life, by the way, and the storytelling elements in the music, they pushed me um, to literature because they were quoting, um, everyone from Shakespeare to Ovid, to Ralph
Iceberg
Ellison.
Slim, all kind
Yeah,
of stuff. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. So it's that was my foray into what I would call literature, even though I wasn't at that time an avid reader, if that makes
mhm.
sense.
It is. And when I hear today about like different pedagogies and people talking about incorporating hip hop and things like that,
Hmm.
I really, like there's something to be said when we talk about cultural responsiveness and sustainability and things like that, and using something like hip hop to engage kids. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's not something I would be good at, but I think everything can be a bridge to anything else. Um, and where kids are is not where you want them to stay. Like we want our children to be able to access anything, but meeting them where they are is really important. And I've had conversations with students, um, particularly a few years ago, and helped them bridge the gap between a Quavo and Amigos and a Common, which ultimately can take them back to an Eric B and a Rakim or the Message or something like that. That they so they can see that the people, the artists that they enjoy and love, are standing on the shoulders of other people, and it's okay for them to stand on the shoulders of other people, and that they need to realize, like when they're reading a Shakespeare, or if they're reading even an Orwell or Ralph Ellison or James Baldwin especially, um, like they're standing on the shoulders of other people as well, and being able to connect those dots is part of um, what it means to make meaning of literature in terms of how it applies to those days and times.
Most definitely. Can I ask you about your library experiences? Like, did you have a school library? What was that experience like? Did you go to the public library?
Hmm. So my library experience was um, outside of school, going to the neighborhood libraries in Detroit because that's where the girls were.
Yep.
So it's like you have um, in middle school, I had my seventh grade teacher. We had to do a major report for every holiday. So like the history of Thanksgiving versus Christmas versus the paganism of Christmas with the the religiosity of Christmas. And it was just like, you know, um, I spent a lot of time in a library, not necessarily checking out books, but like reading the books that I needed for my report. But it was a thing to go to the library on the weekends because I knew that's where Shante Walker and Terry Vickers were going to be. It was like an impetus to go to the library. So yeah, I think that was my first foray, and I distinctly remember the layout of the library, but I don't necessarily remember librarians, which is probably
Yeah,
bad.
did they engage with you? Well, it's a two-way street, right? Did the librarians engage with you at all or anything like that?
Yeah, I always, because they took us right where we needed to go. Like we didn't have like a library in my middle or my elementary school. So there was no library science. I had no knowledge of like the Dewey Decimal System, or, this is where you go to find, biography versus history versus like, so we were following them around the library.
Okay.
And it's funny because looking back, I was the only kid in the hood with a typewriter and Britannica encyclopedias. Like my parents were, like they put their money where their mouth was. I'll just say that. They put their money where their mouth was.
So would you say, you mentioned your dad and reading, would you say he was your reading role model? And if so, what were the things that, what were the things you say lead to saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I don't remember, we didn't have a large library in our house, but there were magazines everywhere, and not like Jet. Like, my dad was into Popular Mechanics, Motor Trend. I grew up in Detroit. My father worked for General Motors, the Wall Street Journal, the Detroit News, the Free Press. He was just an avid current events fan, but growing up, he had this poster, this Lord of the Rings poster on his closet door. And as I think about it now, he actually read The Hobbit to me when I was maybe 5. And now I'm dating myself even further because I had this goofy, probably was like 6, this goofy record player. It was orange and it was portable. It came in a briefcase, and pop it open, you plug it in, and it would play The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings on books, not like the full version of the stories, but these like 6 and 7-year-old versions. And my dad was huge into sci-fi and fantasy when he did read books. He was in a Dune.
Wow. Oh no.
He was into the Star Wars. He was also big into I forgot her name, Octavia Butler. Before she was a phenomenon, he was into her as well. So yeah, my dad was definitely that guy in terms of I read for enjoyment, I read for information, I read to take me to another place. I read because I don't want to be bothered with human beings, right? Like that's my dad.
That's interesting too, like Lord of the Rings and things like that, because I think a lot of trends that I've researched in history, it was hard for us to connect to anything outside of, like our realm. We are not put in spaces to think about the future or creatively or in terms of science fiction. So that's pretty unique, that's very unique. So how did you get into education?
I pretty much knew um, that I wanted to be a teacher. I had a negative experience that I'll only tease for the audience because I talk about it in detail in the book, but a negative experience that impacted me. And I pretty much knew this happened my freshman year in high school. And I pretty much knew when I got to undergrad that I either wanted to be an attorney or I wanted to be a teacher. So there was really no need. I was an English major. There was really no need to change my major because I said once if I decide to change my mind and go to law school, I could just lean on my English degree. And if I decide that I wanted to focus on education, I could lean on my English degree. But I think I was probably like halfway through my freshman year at Howard when I said, yeah, we're not we're not changing majors. I'm gonna stick with this. So I was pretty sure of it early on during my time in undergrad.
So, I mean, I kind of had a similar path where I knew that I wanted to be an educator. I wanted to not have students experience what I experienced, right? So I was already a librarian, so I was like, I just want to give kids all, let's just show kids all the stuff that's out there. But when you actually got into schools, what was it like for you? Like, what was the give and take of the realities of teaching once you got in there?
Yeah. So, and let me say this. I have to take a step back. I would be remiss if I didn't mention, because even though that story is true, um, I had the opportunity to come to DC for the Million Man March, and it changed my worldview on Black people, and then it changed my worldview on Black men. And my takeaway from the march was Desmond has to do something that's going to make the world a better place for African Americans. So that was in the back of my mind when a year or so, really a year and a half later, because you're talking October of 1995 versus like February of 1997. Well, I said, yeah, I'm definitely staying in and gonna stick with education. So I kind of have to shout out the Million Man March and my friends Damon and Fred for letting me tag along without contributing no gas money and nothing.
Awesome.
But yeah.
So when you were there, like, and you start seeing the bureaucracy of education,
Mhm.
and you want to do your part, what were some of the things that were some of your successes, and what were some of the things that you were like, this is bigger than me? You know what I mean? Like, and how do I attack this?
Yeah. So I think teachers are young and first year teachers are much more sophisticated than I was when I entered the profession. I had a really good principal. I had a really good assistant principal my first few years in the field. And, I was hell bent on becoming a good teacher. It was about the pedagogy. Like I split education into there's the pedagogy and there's the politics. The politics were not really something that I worried about. Um, my job was to be the best teacher I could be. Like I wasn't running to Staples, buying markers and things like that. Like those things were provided for us. I wasn't scrambling for material. Like I had those things. So the politics of it came into play in that I was a special education teacher, and I figured out kind of at the beginning of my second year that we were warehousing children, meaning we had children that as a special education department, teachers were referring children because they didn't want those children to be counted towards standardized testing. And I distinctly remember being in an IEP meeting, Tiffany, and we were going over. It was a reevaluation for a student, meaning a child had already been in education and had been qualified for special education, and had been in special education for 3 years. And I said, this kid is getting B's and C's, and everything about this kid is flat. And like, we're saying this kid has a learning disability, but like he presents like all of the other students. He doesn't have any behavior problems. Shouldn't he just be in a general ed setting all the time? And I remember our school counselor kicking me from underneath the table. And our coordinator said, yeah, but you don't know how that reduction in hours is going to look. And I was like, well, shouldn't that be the conversation instead of leaving his hours the same? That was my foray into the politics of teachers closing ranks, not necessarily doing what's best for children, not wanting to rock the boat, even though that was an unspoken herd. Like, of course, we should be thinking about reducing his hours. And of course, we should think about what's best for the child. But sometimes it's just easy to move forward with the status quo because, you know, schools and we institutionalize behaviors and they benefit someone, they just don't always benefit the customer.
So when you're there and you're teaching, and then did you start noticing patterns with Black boys and things like that? And what was your take? What was going through your mind at that time?
Yeah, it was, I ended up leaving the school that I stayed my first 2 years at. And actually I went to work at a special needs school, and it just was elevated 400% because we were receiving children who had acquired attorneys and they had sued the school system. So during the due process, parent lawyer takes child out of said DC public schools and plucks them into this private school while they're waiting evaluations and a court hearing and things like that. And just to see how I was part of a school that was part of a process that was using Black children and using Black boys, because 80% of our students were Black males, right? It was really eye-opening because it wasn't about what's best for the child. It was about how do we as an institution sustain ourselves. And you sustain yourself by bringing in revenue, and you bring in revenue by taking children from DC public schools. And to look at what those kids weren't getting in terms of instruction, in terms of services, the only thing they got from us was love and tenderness and devotion. Like, and our teachers were not prepared. Our teachers did not know the special education process. Therapeutically, we could not serve the needs of those children. It was just in retrospect, it was a nightmare. And you know, there's no real space on this planet for conversation around, which is why I thank you for this opportunity. There's no real space on this planet to have conversations about how systems oppress and abuse oppressed groups of people in the public forum, right? Like, dude, that's happening right in front of us. That's not in Brazil. That's not in Mexico. This is not in a quote unquote developing country. That's in Detroit. That's Chicago. That's Washington, DC, where that's happening. Like, we have students in Detroit suing the school system in a class action lawsuit because they're denied the opportunity to read. Like, that's like 3 years ago, and people are watching Sports Center instead. Like, it's it's literally happening in real time.
Do we have the right to read? Do we have the right to read? I ask that question all the time. Please answer. You know what I mean? Like, it amazes me how people get perplexed by that. But I'm like, no, look around you. Those scores are that way for a reason.
Yeah, and the answer to that question is no. And what capitalism tells you is you have the freedom to get the opportunity to learn how to read. Those are two different things. Like, the freedom to have the opportunity and the right to read are two very distinct ideological perspectives. One is built on community and one is built on cannibalism. They're completely different. You have the opportunity, the freedom to have the opportunity to do that.
So
right?
I liked how you said that when you were teaching, there was this aspect of really like, you could just love a kid. You like to give them that sense of something. Where did you feel that you had success, especially with Black boys? What was your space that you're like, okay, I feel like I'm doing something here?
Yeah, I think it was around learning that we could have conversations and exit children from special education. That was like the beginning for me. And then the teaching of reading. And I talk painstakingly, I think, in the book about um, my quest to learn how to become a solid reading teacher, because again, you're a special education teacher in the hood, so you're a de facto teacher of boys. And even when you look across the landscape nationally, half of the children in special ed are in special ed because of some language-based issue, whether they're speech and language impaired or whether they have a learning disability. For the most part, those 34% of children who are learning disabled, it's more on a reading side than it is on a math side, right? So, I'm a new teacher, and in my graduate school sequence, we're learning the special ed process, we're learning assessment, we're learning, behavior development and how to manage classrooms. And there are no methods in pedagogy classes. And it's like, you're teaching like Black boys in the hood. Like, yeah, I had Ricky, Doughboy, like and Trey in my classroom, and none of them can read, and I couldn't teach them. And they're third, fourth, and fifth graders. And it's like, dude, you go home at night and you read the newspaper, you read Invisible Man, and you don't know how to pass that process on to kids. So for me, I spent as much time in teachers' classrooms as I could. And I asked all the forbidden and dumb questions. Like, how do you do, like, why are you doing that? Like, why are you teaching capital letters before you teach lowercase letters? And why are you teaching EA instead of OA? Like help me understand that process. And there was a lot of cobbling and putting stuff together on my own. And there was a lot of trial and error, I would say. But I would say that second success was helping children say, you know what, Mr. Williams, I'm not tripping during reading today because I feel confident that I can do the work that you're going to put in front of me. And I had a student who is probably like 30 years old now, but she placed fifth in a citywide spelling bee. And ultimately, she was exited from special education as well. So I think, like, in terms of the early successes, those were some of the things. Like, we gotta, all of these kids ain't special ed, right? And then what can we do to really focus on the foundational reading skills that kids don't have, didn't get for whatever reason?
So, what do most teachers overlook with literacy intervention, especially as it pertains to Black boys? Like, what are some of the things that we overlook that we need to be more intentional or mindful about?
I don't know if I have the answer to that. I think I approach that question as like, do we have the appropriate expectations for our children? Because if children don't get the skills they need to read, and I mean understand print, we have a habit in this country of just following structures. And the way things are set up, the expectation is that children are going to learn the code. They're going to be able to read words in print by third grade. So, like, we're going to front load the most important thing that kids get in the first 25% of their education. And I think the thing that we get wrong is what happens if they don't have it in fourth grade? What happens if they don't have it in fifth grade? And what happens if they don't have it in middle school? So I think that the notion of you don't have it now and we're just going to move you forward, or we're going to hold you back without a specific set of interventions that are going to support you, is mind boggling. And the idea of fourth grade teachers and fifth grade teachers and upper elementary teachers, because in some schools that kind of foundational phonemic awareness and teaching of the code stops early in third grade, and kids are just expected to have it, right? But again, going back to the conversation we were having offline, that's a very purposeful and intentional conversation, because third grade is the segue and the foray, excuse me, into high stakes testing, right? We're testing children third through eighth grade, and then again in maybe ninth and or 10th grade. So that's a very intentional thing. You have to read to learn now. And
Yep.
it's like, we've been reading to learn since kindergarten. Like, if kids don't have what they need, you're not a math teacher. You're not a third grade teacher. You teach kids. If they don't have it, it's criminal. It's gaslighting to have the opportunity to give it to them and not give it. Like, that's just, it's literally a criminal enterprise, like
Yep.
literally.
Yep, wholeheartedly. So let's talk about your book a bit. The Burning House, Educating Black Boys in Modern America.
Mhm.
Why did you decide to write this book?
So I think part of it was, if I can give the long version, I was working at an all boys school, and I don't really think my boss respected me, I think, to put it blunt. And I started thinking about how I could express these skills and these feelings that I was having about the space that I was in. So the first step was, I started a Twitter chat, and I was new to Twitter. I had been in education for approximately 12 years at that point. I was working at an all boys school, and I figured out, like, you really don't have a sense of what Black boys should have. Like, you work at a school that's all boys. It was a school with boys and not a school for boys. So I was like, Desmond, you should really have that. So there was a lot of research that was happening in real time. I was really reinventing myself as a teacher, and I was just getting tons of information from connecting and collaborating with teachers over social media. And I ended up staying at that school and became an administrator there. And really the process became, how do I turn my classroom, which at that point had become a demonstration classroom for Black boys, how do I spread that throughout the entire building and make this a school for boys? Like, we're building identity, we're doing the cultural responsive thing. We are partnering with parents and having candid conversations with parents about what needs to happen in the home to build our boys up. But at the same time, thinking about, what parents wanted for their children in the next phase, because we were a K-5 school. Like, that process was very important, and there was still more that needed to be done. So I just kind of kept writing. And part of it was, I had made so many mistakes, Tiffany. It just made sense to put thoughts on paper to help others avoid those mistakes. And I talk about being, complicit in a system. Like, how do you avoid that complicity in the system? How do you avoid being used? And how do you avoid being used and not know you're being used? Like, what does that look like? Like, what are the look fors for usury, like, in a system, right? Like, we can talk to our friends about that. Girl, you can't go out with him and you paying on the first date. Like, we can do that, right? But, like, how does that look in a professional space
So true. And
where
it's
you're
so
saying,
hard.
man, you got bills to pay, right?
Yeah.
Though that's what I wanted to pass on to the reader in very, like, distinct and scriptive terms, under the auspice of um, this cloud of racism,
Yeah.
and articulating, because I think what's happened over the last 15 years, Tiffany, is Black folk are patting themselves on the back because we've gotten very good at articulating what racism looks like and feels like in different spaces. And white liberalism has allowed for that, but that doesn't change the power dynamic between Black and white people. So in that articulation, how are we galvanizing ourselves and organizing ourselves to fight what I believe is an existential threat to our people? Like, that's ultimately why I wrote the book.
Some of the aspects that you're talking about, like I've just begun like reading about when they talk about like fugitive education and things like that. But I want to step back a bit too to talk about the parent relationship. What are some things in terms of the parent relationship that needs to be, like more of a discussion? It's hard.
Yeah, parents are never the same from community to community, right? And I believe parents put their best foot forward, regardless of what we may think. Parents are always putting their best foot forward. But I think for us as educators, we also have to remember that we are the proxy, and it's always a partnership, even though we might feel like we're doing more of the work, even though we may have a child whose parents are highly involved. It's like they're doing all of the work. This kid came to us in second grade. He's reading at a fifth grade level, and he's always got his homework done. All I got to do is just not mess him up. He's going to, right? It differs from community to community and child to child. But I think in terms of my interaction with parents, the golden rules is parents are always doing their best. B, you have to do as an educator, you have to do as a school all that you can with that child, because our place in a child's life is temporary. We may have that kid for 4 years, we may have that kid for 5 years. Even with social media, like, your opportunity to teach that child is a very finite time in a child's life. You do with it what you can. If and when the parents are involved in that process, that's great. And sometimes you may feel that you are teaching that child despite the parent, right? Like, I um, distinctly remember parents saying, you know what, I told him that if somebody put their hands on him, then he need to send them to the cemetery. And I'm like, but after he sent him to the cemetery, I'm gonna send his ass home for 4 days. Right? You do know that. So, right, like, the values clash between home and school. But I think that quote unquote values clash, what I used to tell teachers in my last stop as principal is like, these parents are dealing with racism. It looks different than what you encounter because you have more resources, but they're dealing with poverty. They're dealing with um, Black men being the fodder for the prison system. Poor choices that we make, right, despite racism, because that's a thing too, right? We have to, be accountable for that, for the decisions that we make. But they're, victims of living in food deserts. They're victims of um, housing discrimination and living in poor communities where Black people have just been shoveled and cast into and have stayed for 50 and 60 years. Like, all of that is part of the mix. If you give up on a child, or if you're condemning and judging a child, then her children are going to be in the same situation in 25 years. So we really have to think actively as teaching as a revolutionary act and as an opportunity to change family trees. And I know sometimes that can be difficult when a parent is yelling at you, or when a parent is telling you that my child gonna beat his butt. He gonna come up there, whip your ass, right? Like that.
Yeah.
Right.
You
Like,
and stop.
Because
I'll
I
meet you in the parking lot. Yeah.
see you in a parking lot. I know you got that black Infinity, your tire slash. Yeah, yeah, right. I've been there, um, but I've never had a parent that wouldn't listen to me one on one, and that's been part of my message to principals. Like if he or she yells at you and you're off as one on one, they freaking hate your guts, right? But 10 times out of 10, there are other pressures that they're dealing with. And you got to give them the opportunity to get past that so that they know that your office, your space can be therapeutic. I would never tell teachers that. Teachers don't get paid enough to manage that. But as administrators, when we do that, it makes it so much easier for those teachers to go back and build a relationship with that particular with that particular parent. And it was easier for parents to want to go back because they know intuitively that it's a safer space for their child than they thought.
I've never heard it like that before. That, your principal has your back and, does certain things, but I don't hear that psychology enough. You know what I mean? Like as a teacher to hear that and to know that, like I, as an administrator, am taking some of the brunt of them getting life off their chest so that they can hear you. You know what I mean? Like that's.
Yeah, no, I didn't allow parents to yell at, you can't do that. Like you can't yell at teachers. You can't yell at your child here, and you can't yell at other people's children. You can yell at me, right? You can yell at my assistant principal. Like let me take that. Like teachers don't, it's just not, it's not in the cards. And I was very protective of everyone because I was always under the impression if I could just get out of people's way, like my teachers would figure it out. Like that was all, like I just hired like super smart people. That was always my thing. Just get out the way and they'll figure it out. But nobody comes to work to be like berated and yelled at because you got issues. I mean, so.
Yeah. So in your book, you talk about there being a paradigm shift in educating Black boys and young Black men for the 21st century. I don't want you to give away too much because people need to buy this book, but can you just give us an idea of some of the, themes that are involved with that?
Yeah, sincerely going back to this idea of articulating racism and its functionality. After the articulation of its functionality, like what are you going to do about it? So we have these conversations about, you know, uh, culturally responsive practices and restorative practices in classrooms and things like that. But ultimately, this is it's bigger than those two things. Like, I think the most delicate way I would put it is when you look at schools in Finland, when you look at the way the South Vietnamese, and the Chinese, and even the Japanese and white people in this country educate their children, they don't talk about cultural responsiveness. Like culturally responsive teaching is something that Black folks made up because our children are being oppressed by a dominant Eurocentric system. So like I use that language because I don't want to confuse people, but this is really about a revolutionary process of controlling the politicians and the politics of your community so you can educate your children. I talk about this like goofy notion of critical race theory. It's like who cares? It's only an issue if you believe your children should learn that and you don't have the opportunity to teach it to your children. That is the very definition of the history of Black people in this country. We are paternalistically told, this is what your children need. This is what we are going to allow to happen. Like whatever we think critical race theory is or isn't, groups of people should be able to say, that doesn't work for our community, or that does work for our community. And historically speaking, African Americans have not been able to do that in this country. So the book is ultimately a referendum on self-determination and the capacity of Black people to organize if we think education should be something beyond having access to the middle class. And that's ultimately the question that I pose. Like, if you want your kids to have access to a middle class lifestyle, then said school down the street, it probably could work, right? Or said charter school, or said it probably can work. But if we want to talk about the 45% of Black males who can't read, that's a different thing, because that is a outcome that's based on inequity. And if you don't look at the history of that gap, then talking about the science of reading is actually goofy. Like that ain't gonna work. And like, so Dr. Tatum's not gonna say it like that, but I'm gonna say it like that. That shit ain't gonna work. Excuse my language.
No,
That's not gonna work. Like, you can't cover up 155 years of chattel slavery and anti-slavery laws with like Scarborough's rope and a reading ladder. Like, who do you think you're talking to? Like, you can't, come on, man. Like,
so what do? We have
am I supposed to,
andragogy, we have teaching adults, and we have this, and we have this method that we know Britt helps decode, right? And helps get you through the code. So then how do we get, like, so, and we have this system, what pieces should we as a community start thinking about prioritizing then? You know what I mean? Because you're right, there's all these different things.
Mhm.
How do we start prioritizing it?
The first thing we have to do is say the people in our schools absolutely believe in our children. Like, we got that, right? Which is not a given, but we got that. And there is a place for ultimately, what the research has told us is that teachers who set high expectations for kids, those are the kids who are successful. Despite what might be inadequacies in my skill set as a teacher. So I'm not disparaging any any form of pedagogy or the science of reading or anything like that. But I'm saying this is not only pedagogy. The politics is equally important. Actually, the politics is 80% of it. That's 80% of it. So once you get that, if we want to have candid conversations and dig into some data and dig into some research around what is the best method, or what are the best methods that are scientifically based versus some action research that some teachers did with a population that looks like yours, then I think those conversations are well and fine. And I'm actually always open to having those conversations, because there are teachers across the country who are doing wonderful things and cobbling things together. But I think it's disingenuous to say, we did this in Mississippi with poor Black kids, and this is what you need. It's like,
Yeah.
I can't fall for that. Like, I can't fall for it. I'm sorry. Like, it's like you're looking at, I can't remember it, and I should know because I should have prepared for this interview more. But the mandatory retention for children who are not reading on grade level by third grade. So when we look at what's, I don't know if you're familiar, but the research study of what was happening in the state of Mississippi when some science of reading experts went into the state, and they had these quote unquote miraculous gains. What they don't tell you is that because of the mandatory retention, these kids were held back, didn't go to fourth grade. They were held back. They repeated third grade. And then we had this quote unquote increase in scores. for fourth graders, but you change the parameters of the testing because those kids who were marginal students or were not reading on grade level, they got held back. So, and I did a lot of research in preparation for the book, and in talking to some people who remain nameless, they know, but don't say out loud that some of that data is shoddy at best, and that the idea of preparing college professors to better prepare teachers is great, but that doesn't necessarily mean that more work doesn't have to be done and that more research is not necessary for us to be able to say we have enough to say that this is going to work for all populations, particularly when all populations hadn't been considered in the first place. Like there's just so much work done, so much more research that needs to be done in that sense.
I question the pre-service teacher experience. I don't think I really, and I took reading content classes, but I think I learned in the trenches. Everything I learned was in the trenches and through professional development and, like the other teachers and things like that. I don't know what I was prepared for going into a class. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and most teachers will, so the teacher preparation thing is really big when we talk about the teaching of reading. I think most of us are better prepared for the teaching of comprehension than we are for the foundational skills. Like there's so much nomenclature and background knowledge. This is a vowel team versus a digraph, it's a diphthong, and phonological and phonemic awareness, and does phonological fall under phonemic, and like how do we even teach vocabulary? Should I be teaching this word because this word doesn't really mean the same thing in this community? That like all of that has to be teased out, and when teachers are not learning to teach over a 4-year process, they're learning to teach over a 2-year process, which is a whole nother conversation. Are they adequately prepared to be in front of the children who actually are in communities that are most in need? Like that's a criminal outfit to put the least prepared in front of those who need the most. That is by nature white supremacy.
Yep. So just a couple more questions. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on what I seem to be noticing as a bigger trend of Black homeschooling? And, like I noticed during COVID, there were these pods that were coming up or people doing that. What are some of your ideas about people, thinking differently about how my child gets educated?
Well, I think you're going to see, I think we are in the midst of the potential collapse of public education. I remember when Trump became president, it was before the inauguration. And he said, yeah, the Department of Education, he's like, we just have to completely defund that. And like, what do they even do? Like there has been, if we just kind of look at the breadcrumbs, Tiffany, over the last 20 years, there's been a deprofessionalization of teaching, which makes it easier to replace people of our age with someone who's like 24 years old who graduated from Yale. Like it's easy to replace us because, we're old dogs. We can't do new tricks. I'm a welfare king. You're a welfare queen. We're just siphoning from the system. So let's replace them. I say that to say that though that replacement of veteran teachers, that replacement of that institutional knowledge is so much easier to do in 2022 than it was in 2002. And I just feel like the system is eroding because the public confidence is not what it was. Education, teaching doesn't have the prestige that it once had. you don't have people people are not breaking their necks to come into the profession. Our principals are more like public health administrators now than they are masters of pedagogy and masters of and masters of quality instruction. So, you know, I think ultimately we are going to see, as people kind of start figuring out what's most important to them, parents who have means are going to be really rethinking public versus private, and are going to be rethinking public versus homeschool.
Mm.
Because I think COVID has taught us so much taught parents so much about what they thought their students, what they thought their children's experiences were, that they're not. And I think for Black families of need, Black families of means, it was like, whoa, I can do that. Like, why should you be subjected to that? Like, I can help you manage that. So, you know, that could be me being paranoid and me reading too much Noam Chomsky. But like when you look at systems as they collapse, the public trust is one of the first things to go in the erosion of the institution, in terms of it's the perspective that it holds versus what it produces in actuality. Those are a few of the first things that start to disintegrate. And I think we, over the last 15 years, have seen those things. So we shall see. It doesn't help when you have a Republican president who says we don't need the Department of Education, and even Trump's cabinet scratched their head when he appointed a Betsy DeVos. Again, you know, a further illustration of the erosion of the public trust. So we'll see where that goes. I hope it's not that. I think one of the great things about America is the opportunity for public education, but at the same time, I think Black and brown people are starting to see that education ultimately is a referendum on self-determination. And if that's not it, it's just passing on information.
Right. Could you tell us, I'm gonna wrap this up, can you tell us about any future projects or what you're looking to do in the future?
Yeah, so I am, as we're recording, in a process of releasing the second edition of The Burning House. The pre-sale is happening now. We start shipping on March 4th. I have a few conference engagements coming up, more than I can even say, but I'm ultimately going to launch a literacy camp this summer. So be on the lookout for that. I want to spend some time connecting students to text, and the camps are 3 to 4 weeks. It's an hour a day. And we'll spend some time reading some texts that are going to kind of push students to question their identity at a physical, gender, spiritual, cultural level. But at the same time, website probably in mid-April, and I'll have more information about that. But also, we're still conducting equity audits, still helping schools support marginalized groups, particularly Black males. And of course, we're still doing work around, you know, thinking about different learning modalities, how that affects the pedagogy of Black boys in school spaces. And the research is telling us that when we do those things, it's helpful to girls, it's not harmful. So it's just a win-win situation all the way around.
Can you tell people where they can find you, so if they want more information?
Sure, you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, at Nylinka. That's Nylinka. The company website is nylinka.org, NYLINKA, and you can find me on LinkedIn at Desmond Williams. But all of that information is there. You can email me, dwilliams@nylinka.org. Yeah, I'm very accessible. And I love connecting with teachers and educators and parents, because I have quite a few conversations with parents post-COVID. I've had lots of conversations with parents. So anything I can do to be a support to your family, to your school, to your district, please reach out.
And lastly, could you give a message to Black boys and young Black men about your thoughts about their education and their future and things of that nature?
Yeah, sure. The message is school is not the only way, but school is one way. And ultimately, it is a game, right? I say, without context, a man with pads on carrying a piece of pig running 30 miles an hour while 11 other guys trying to tackle him sounds completely ridiculous. But in another context, that's football, right? So a teacher asking you to read a poem from a dead white guy who died 600 years ago might seem completely ridiculous, but that's part of the game of school. So you have to keep things in context. And just because you're asked to do that does not mean you're compromising anything, right? It's all a game. And if you look at it any differently, you put yourself in a position where people can disqualify you. And ultimately, this game is about disqualifying Black men. So do not disqualify yourself because you feel as though you're being compromised as you participate in the game. It's just a game. And ultimately, you're going to be judged by the statistics that you produce, because it's a game.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with We Are Here Lit today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Tiffany. Thank you, thank you, thank you.